So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Professor Rasmus Larsen. We're very fortunate to have him come and speak with us this evening. So Professor Larsen is an award-winning assistant professor at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, where he lectures in the Forensic Science Program and Department of Philosophy. Among his many accolades, Professor Larsen earned the Dean Excellence Award at the University of Toronto, Mississauga in 2019 and 2021, as well as the UTM Forensic Science Program Research Award in June 2022, and the Conant New Research Award in July 2022. That's pretty impressive there, Mr. Larsen. Professor Larsen, you've earned quite the awards there. Professor Larsen's research falls within the broad category of philosophy of science and forensic epistemology. As a philosopher, Professor Larsen is particularly interested in how we can improve the scientific understanding of mental illness. His interests in forensics are focused mostly on the role of psychiatric disorders in judicial settings, as well as the epistemic status of forensic theories and methods. Professor Larsen is currently authoring a book under MIT Press about psychopathy entitled Psychopathy Unmasked: The Rise and Fall of a Dangerous Diagnosis. So without further delay, it is my absolute great pleasure to turn things over to Professor Larsen. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and Professor Larsen, it's all over to you. Thanks for your time this evening.
Thank you, Erin. Thanks for having me, and thanks for that wonderful introduction. Let me see if I can get the technology working on my side as well. I think this seems fine, right?
Yep, I can see it, and it's all good to go.
All right. Yeah, so today I will talk with you, or hopefully we can have a conversation afterwards, but we will be talking about psychopath or psychopathy, and that the title of the talk is of course starts a little bit with a statement: psychopath, they're social predators, ! And then I'm kind of hinting at that there are some difficulties and challenges with this statement here. So hopefully it's going to be clear as I proceed what exactly I mean by that. But let's just start from some very, very basic observations here. If we look at Canada or any other society kind of across the globe, you will make some pretty clear and stable observations, namely that there are problems with crime and violent behavior, right? So for example, in Canada, in 2021, we had 788 homicides. We, for example, had almost 35,000 police reported sexual assaults. We had several thousand hate crimes reported as well. And we have also made estimates of how much crime really cost our society. It's estimated that there's a bill on around $85 billion every year that we spend in just combating crime, in lost work power or workforce, or what you will, from people suffering from the outcomes of crime and so forth. And we also just have this perpetual problem, meaning that criminals, when they have been given a sentence, and if they've gone through a judicial system, in Ontario, for example, roughly around 40% will end up recommitting a new crime, or they will recidivate, as we say, is the technical term for this. So there's just this perpetual crime in societies, not only in Canada, but across the world, really. And we can, of course, just trivially ask, why is it that we have a problem with violence and crime? Now, there are many different explanations why that is. And depending on which expert you ask, they will all emphasize different factors to contribute to violence and crime rates. But one theory that forensic psychologists are really have paid a lot of attention to and spent a lot of resources studying is this idea that there are these very few individuals out there that we refer to as psychopath, or a personality disorder called psychopathy, or psychopathic personality disorder. And these individuals are really responsible for a drastically disproportionate part of the crime, disproportionate to how many psychopaths there really are out there. So what is a psychopath? Well, A psychopath has been described as a social predator, and here famously described by Canadian researcher Robert Hare as a person who's completely lacking in conscience and feelings for others, and they selfishly take what they want and do as they please, violating social norms and expectations without the slightest sense of guilt and regret. Psychopaths have also been described as these individuals who, well, they look normal on the surface. They might be charming and they might seem to have just normal intelligence, as if there's nothing peculiar about them. But if you really look under the surface, you will see that this veneer of normality is really just masking this vile nature, as Robert Hare talks about, that they lack conscience, that they have no empathy for anyone. In forensic psychology, the way we deal with this diagnosis, if you want to call it this, is that we have instruments to how we actually figure out who are the psychopaths in not necessarily across society, but at least the people that come in through the judicial system. Once a person is arrested or is being brought to trial, or after trial, even after you have been convicted, there's a chance that they might see a psychologist or a psychiatrist that will eventually assess, as it's called, assess them for psychopathy. And the idea is that we have this manual, this description of the disorder, if you will, that describes psychopathy using these 20 different personality traits and behaviors, or these 20 items that I have listed on this slide here. So you see there are, if we just start from the top, from number 1, for example, glibness and superficial charm. And if you go down the list, you can kind of see the description getting more and more accurate, right? We have a grandiose sense of self-worth and pathological lying, lack of remorse and guilt, shallow affect, lack of empathy, and so forth. And we go also into the behaviors such as criminal versatility and impulsivity, irresponsibility, and so forth. So all in all, a person that kind of exemplifies perhaps what you would call the worst of the worst, the social predators of our society, if you will. Now, the way this works in practice, I'm not going to go too much into detail with this, but there's basically a scoring system. So we say that if a person matches this description to a strong degree, we then move on towards and say that this person is a psychopath, or we diagnose them with psychopathic personality. And that little tidbit of information will be kind of written into their forensic records, or just like when you go to the doctor, for example, and your patient journal contains information of some illness you had 2 years ago or something like that. The same way here, this information is kind of tracked in this way. So if you score 30 points out of 40 on this checklist, you will have this thing called psychopathy on your forensic file, if you will. Now, so these individuals who score high on this checklist, they're believed to be, as I mentioned, disproportionately responsible for the majority of violent crimes in society, right? So there are very few of them in our society, according to forensic psychologists, maybe only just about 1%. Here I mentioned 0.6 to 2.3%, but roughly forensic psychologists believe that roughly around 1% of the population would kind of match these criteria that we have put up, right? And they are just overrepresented in our judicial system, such as in our prisons, for example. And also they bear really a large part of the monetary toll that comes from crime, given that they are allegedly so criminally prolific. Now, so why is this important? Why is this diagnosis important? Well, if we just pause for a moment here quickly and just think about it, our legal system is actually built up in a way where we want to reserve extra, what can you say, punishment might not be the right word here, but we want to reserve extra legal constriction towards those offenders who are high risk and really prolific. And we might want to be a little bit more mild and mitigating towards offenders who might have committed a mistake, made a mistake, committed a crime and so on, but might not be of high risk, right? So we want to treat people differently in our legal system. For example, if you offer parole, you're only going to be given parole if you're considered a low risk person, right? So how does the psychopathy weigh in all this? Well, one way is that it matters during sentencing. So for example, if a person has a psychopathy diagnosis, that might propel a judge to consider the higher end of the spectrum in their sentencing guidelines, for example. It might also influence how we place such a person within the judicial system. For example, do we send the person to a low risk facility or to a high risk, a maximum security facility? If you have a psychopathy diagnosis, it might play in favor of sending that person to a maximum security. And we also have in the United States, for example, if we have seen that this diagnosis has been used to support capital sentencing over just imprisonment of life in prison. We also see evidence that is used heavily in the parole system. So if you apply for parole, if you have a psychopathy diagnosis, you're probably not going to get parole. And we also have other areas of our judicial system where we see that the psychopathy diagnosis kind of weigh in. And here we can clearly see that the picture here is legal constriction, meaning that if you, God forbid, commits a crime, if you end up and go through the legal system, you might want to think that it would be better for you not to have this diagnosis kind of hanging as a little price tag on your shoulders, right? That it's going to make your traveling through the legal system a lot less pleasant, if you will. You're going to get longer sentences and you're going to get placed in institutions that you might not consider ideal, right? And so forth. We also see historically that this use of psychopathy diagnosis is really something relatively novel development in our legal system. So you guys are probably too young to remember the 1990s, but if it's only really in the late 1990s that we see our legal system, and here I mean in North America especially, starting to really take this diagnosis seriously. So we see that there's this exponential growth over the last 2 to 3 decades in how we use this diagnosis. So for example, it's actually across the world becoming one of the most used ways to assess risk of offenders within the legal system. But we also see it in the graph on the left here, that we see it in the criminal court records. We can see that the diagnosis kind of pops up in how an offender is described. Now, so let's again pause. Why is this an interesting development to pay attention to? If you just think about it, we are saying all these things about psychopaths, that they are extra dangerous. For example, they have this that they exemplify this extreme offender type with the lack of conscience and so forth, namely that they are extreme, that they're the worst of the worst. But we have to ask ourselves whether that is also true. It is, of course, trivial to use the term psychopathy to denote a person who is extreme and just say, hey, if there's an extreme offender out there, we can call him a psychopath. That's, of course, a trivial act, and everybody can do that. It doesn't require a degree in forensic psychology to do exactly that. What we're really interested in is really this, whether the people we diagnose as psychopath, whether they also are measurably extreme and measurably dangerous compared to other offenders. Now, why is that important? You might ask. Why is it also important that I can actually demonstrate that there are these discrepancies between people who score high on this psychopathy checklist and people who don't? Well, it's for the reason that I've just outlined. It matters if you have this diagnosis on you, right? If it turns out, for example, that people we diagnose as psychopaths are not more dangerous than any other average criminal in our judicial system, it would mean that we had given the person with the diagnostic label on them extra sentences, extra long sentences, for example, no parole, where the other people had just gone scot-free, right? So that seems to be just unfair to begin with. but there's also just a deeper professional, what can you say, incentive to wanting to be able to show that there's also this difference between psychopath or people who score high on this checklist and people who don't. In a similar way, if you might compare this to when you go to your doctor and ask for treatment for a certain disease, you want your doctor to be able to give you the medicine and the treatment that he or she has evidence for working, right? It's the same way here when we use a diagnosis like psychopathy, we want to be able to demonstrate empirically that we have scientific evidence that is actually also the case that psychopaths are more dangerous. So this is why this really matters, in my opinion. Now, before we answer that question, whether psychopaths really are as dangerous as we say, I just want to include you in a little thought experiment. So try to follow me here just for a moment. Think about this. How dangerous do you really think psychopaths are compared to ordinary offenders? If you just intuitively had to like inquire yourself or ask yourself that question, if you like, of course you could come up with some silly answer. I think they're twice as dangerous, but what does that really mean, right? So let's try to put some numbers on this just to see if we can do this in an intuitive way. Let's imagine that I make a funny and really wild experiment. Let's just say I received a lot of money from the Ontario government to make an experiment here in Mississauga where I'm sitting. So I go down to the Mississauga prison. I don't know if there's a prison in Mississauga, but let's just imagine that there was. And I have been given authority to release everyone from prison on Monday morning, right? So everybody's going to be released from prison. And then at some point, as I mentioned early on, some of these offenders are going to start reoffending. Some of them might not. Some might say, hey, this is a great opportunity. I'm not going to end up in prison again because prison is not fun. But some people might end up in prison, right? So, and let's just say that I measured how all these individuals were doing over the course of the years, maybe over the course of 40 years, if I lived that long, and I collected data on how many extra years in prison each person received, right? We can then imagine here that maybe on average, all these offenders we released from prison, they would all get an average of 6 extra years in prison, because some people might go out and commit a robbery, maybe a violent assault and so forth and so forth. And some people might not even get something, but you can see as this distribution, you can follow me and think, okay, let's just hypothetically say that there was an average of 6 extra years in prison to everybody who was released from Mississauga prison. Now, let me ask you a question now then. How much, if we say that this curve you're seeing here with all these individuals from Mississauga, let's just say that these are the non-psychopaths, the people who score low on the checklist that I just showed you. And then we can imagine the people who score high on the checklist as being a different curve that you're kind of switching or positioning to the right from the non-psychopath, right? So you can see here the way that I have drawn this dotted curve, there seems to be a higher average of extra years that they're getting, right? And I can maybe set another hypothetical curve. If it's this much of a difference, there's even larger difference in their averages. So I just want to ask you, like, intuitively, how far do you think we should switch or position the curve of the psychopath compared to the non-psychopath before you're satisfied with saying, hey, you know, the social predators, the psychopath of society, this is how much more dangerous they are? For example, do you think is that much, for example? I'm just asking you just to test your own intuitions, how much you're willing to kind of guess, if you will. But you can also kind of contextualize it a little bit more to saying that, okay, if it means that the people who are normal, quote unquote, or non-psychopath are given just ordinary parole opportunities, ordinary sentencing lengths, then you can also say that, well, before we can justify giving longer sentences, for example, or not giving parole to those who are psychopaths, there needs to be some sort of a difference between them before we can say that we need to make this seemingly unfair treatment between the two groups, but it's essentially not unfair because the danger that the one group represents is so much higher than the other. Hopefully you're following me in this little thought experiment. So I'm not giving you, this is not data, I'm just something to probe your intuitions, what you think about this. Now, so I have, together with my research group, actually run the numbers on these experiments, and the results are actually quite surprising, which is kind of what my work here at the University of Toronto has kind of been about the last many years. And also the book I'm writing is kind of about issues like these. So it turns out that we actually have hundreds of experiments where we have done something similar to what I just told you. It's not that we had released everyone from prison on Monday and then just followed them over years. That's not exactly how we do. But most of the times we have to release prisoners from prison at some point. And then what we do is that we can actually follow them in our records and see how well they do. And some of those that we release will be psychopath and some will be non-psychopath. And then we can kind of start to compare them. And we actually have hundreds of experiments like these, which are done on thousands of individuals. And in this one paper I put up here, my colleagues and I kind of took all these experiments and kind of just layered them and just saw what is the average data that we get here. So the difference that we find here statistically, and this is just a statistic normative language, is that we find a weak to moderate difference. So what the heck does that weak to moderate difference mean? Well, let's take our a similar way of framing it as that thought experiment I gave you a little bit ago. Let's look at the non-psychopath as represented by this curve here, this normal distribution. And we say that just a little bit different from the one I just gave you, but we just say that, hey, if we release people from prison, those who are situated to the right on this curve are those who recidivate really quick, right? So you might have all the way to the side, those are the people who end up in prison 2 weeks after we have released them. And if we go to the left side, those are the people who just take years before they come in contact with the legal system again. And then you have some sort of a distributed middle here, an average, if you will. This is how much difference there is between people who score high on the psychopath checklist and those who do not. Roughly this much. In other words, there is a weak to moderate difference in what we call effect sizes. That's a statistical claim that you can learn everything about if you go to the University of Toronto. In short, what it actually means is that the difference is of a size that we can barely see with our naked eyes. So if I stood at Mississauga prison and looked at who came in and they all had a t-shirt on that said, you know, a psychopath or a non-psychopath, I wouldn't be able to tell with a naked eye which group came in faster than or the other. I wouldn't be able to tell you. I would have to actually crunch the numbers to figure out which group is the most dangerous. This strikes me as really, really peculiar, surprising finding that those that we call social predators, psychopath of our society, are really not that more dangerous than ordinary, randomly selected criminals. Now, I'm ending my talk here with a couple of slides. I'm only given 20 to 25 minutes today. So I just want to say that this also, our finding here also adds to other really surprising findings in a literature that's really growing, especially the last 10 years. For example, we have a lot of research now on these claims that psychopaths have different moral compasses, that they have no empathy and all that. It doesn't really show that in our studies. We also have brain scan studies that in the 1990s, people were really enthusiastic about finding that psychopaths have different brain. That has not turned out to actually be true the last 10 years also. And there's also been genetics research. Maybe psychopaths have different genes, and maybe that's what's making them different. And it's also just not the case. We haven't found any of that. And there's also been research talking about that they don't have any emotions, or at least have different emotions compared to normal people. That is also just not panned out. So overall, we're sitting here with a picture of psychopath that just doesn't seem to actually fit that way that we describe psychopath. Or let's try that one again. The data that we get in on those people we diagnose as psychopath, it doesn't actually fit that description we have of them, right? So there's something here that has to give, right? I think there's all sorts of questions this really raises. First of all, I just think it's curious to see that when we forensic psychologists do everything we can to figure out how we can find out who are the worst of the worst, why is it that we're so, excuse me for on behalf of myself and my colleagues, why are we so bad at it? I just think that's a curious question to ask. Second also, and I think this is really the ethical challenge of all this, what do we do to the people who have been subjected to these constrictive measures in our legal system? We're not talking about a handful of people here. We're talking about thousands of people on a North American scale. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. What do we do with these people who have been given longer sentences, who wasn't given parole? They were dealt these constrictive measures because we thought they were extreme offenders. But it turns out, according to the data, they're just not extreme offenders. This just seems intuitively or inherently unfair to me. And then lastly, and this is a question that I entertain a lot in my own research and also the book I'm writing right now, maybe all of this is just underscoring a much more fundamental truth than maybe this thing that we call psychopathy or psychopath or psychopathic personality disorder. Maybe it's just not a real disorder. Maybe it's just something that we were wrong about. Maybe, when we created all these theories and started all this research, it was just based on a fundamental wrong assumption that this is actually real. Yeah. Okay, thanks for listening to me. Hopefully I didn't lose the crowd here. I think I will just end it here and open it up to any questions that people might have in the audience. Thank you for listening.
Great. Thanks, Professor Larsen. That was amazing.